From the day I married Carlos in that small church in Valencia, I knew that my mother-in-law Elena would be a challenge in my life. The wedding itself was already a harbinger of what was to come. Elena insisted on changing the flowers she had chosen for those she considered more traditional. She reorganized the guest list including half a neighborhood we didn't even know, and she almost managed to convince Carlos that we should change the honeymoon in Tenerife for a more sensible trip to his sister's house in Toledo. It wasn't just his constant presence in our house in the Ruzafa neighborhood, but his obsessive need to control every aspect of Carlos's life. At first, I tried to be understanding. After all, Carlos was her only child and she had been a widow since my father-in-law died in that traffic accident on the A3 15 years ago. But when our children, Lucia and Miguel, came into the world, their interference became unbearable. The mornings began with his calls at 7:30, just when we were trying to organize the children for school. "Have you already given them the orange juice that I brought you yesterday? Valencian oranges are the best, not like those from the supermarket that you buy." And so began another day under his constant scrutiny. Elena lived just 3 streets away, in an old apartment full of photos of Carlos as a child, and she found any excuse to have a little time. His surprise visits became so frequent that I practically had to count on his presence at every meal. He would settle into our kitchen as if it were his own, rearranging the cabinets because that's how Carlos is used to it. He even went so far as to rearrange the furniture in the children's room while I was working in the office, arguing that the energy flowed better that way. Elena began making decisions about our children's education without consulting us. One day, I came home and discovered that he had enrolled Lucia in piano lessons at the neighborhood conservatory, because all girls from a good family should play an instrument. It didn't matter that Lucia had expressed her love for soccer 1,000 times, Elena insisted that this was not appropriate for a young lady. He organized their schedules, chose their extracurricular activities, and even tried to dictate their eating routines, criticizing him for allowing them to occasionally eat at McDonald's after school. The afternoons became a constant battle. While trying to help Miguel with his math homework, Elena appeared with her own teaching methods. That's how Carlos learned, and look how well he did at university. It didn't matter that educational methods had changed in the last 30 years, she insisted that her way was the only correct one. The most frustrating thing was seeing how Carlos submitted to her wishes, as if he were still a small child needing his mother's approval. At parent meetings at Cervantes School, where our children studied, Elena insisted on accompanying us, sitting between Carlos and me, whispering comments about how she would have handled each different situation. Family dinners became a silent battlefield. Elena always found a way to mention how she had raised Carlos, suggesting that my parenting methods were inadequate. Carlos never had problems eating vegetables, she said as Miguel pushed the artichokes off his plate. "You have to know how to cook them properly." I held my tongue as she subtly criticized every decision we made as a couple, especially mine. Weekends, which should be our family time, became an extension of his control. She planned excursions to the biopark of Valencia or the port of Sagunta without consulting us, and Carlos simply nodded, afraid of contradicting her. "Children need culture," he said, while canceling our plans to go to Malvarosa Beach because it's too sunny. The holidays were especially difficult. During the phallus, she insisted that we dress the children in specific traditional costumes that she had chosen, and she would organize our schedule to view all the masclitas from points that she considered the only appropriate ones. At Christmas, it was unthinkable not to have dinner at her house on Christmas Eve, and the menu had to be exactly the same as what she had prepared for the last 30 years. The situation got worse when I started working more hours at the advertising agency. Elena took advantage of my absence to increase her presence at home, even going so far as to reorganize my own closet because this way Carlos will find things more easily when he needs to help you. Her comments about how a mother should be more present at home became more frequent and pointed. The neighbors of the neighborhood, especially Mrs. Amparo from 3B, began to give me looks of compassion. "Oh, daughter, I went through the same thing with my mother-in-law," she told me while hanging the clothes in the interior patio. "But you have to arm yourself with patience, because we Valencian mothers-in-law are very much ours." Her words of comfort, while well-intentioned, only served to remind me how public our family drama had become. Family gatherings became a showcase where Elena exhibited her control over our lives. At the Sunday pilas she organized on her terrace, she would brag to her friends about how, thanks to her, the children were so well educated, while I watched how my children became increasingly dependent on her approval for every small decision. The final straw came when Elena began to suggest changes to our intimate routine as a couple. "Carlos has always been one for going to bed early," she commented during dinner, giving me meaningful glances when we stayed up watching a series on Netflix after putting the kids to bed. "Then he gets up tired to work, and that can't be." Everything exploded in June, just when the Valencian heat was beginning to become unbearable and the cicadas were singing incessantly in the orange trees on the street. For months I had been planning our family holiday to Benidorm. I booked a beautiful beachfront apartment on Levant Beach, researched activities for the kids, even found a restaurant that served seafood-free paella especially for Miguel, who is allergic. Lucia couldn't stop talking about the Terra Mítica water park, and Miguel had already prepared his new snorkeling equipment. But Elena, as always, had other plans. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was in an important meeting at the agency, my phone kept vibrating with messages from the family WhatsApp group. Elena had unilaterally decided to rearrange our vacation. Not only had he cancelled the reservations I had so carefully made, but he had already organized a trip to his sister Maribel's country house in Cuenca, arguing that it would be more appropriate for the family and more economical in these difficult times. Although she well knew that both Carlos and I had stable jobs and could perfectly afford beach vacations. Maribel's house, an old building in the middle of nowhere, was the last place we wanted to spend our vacation. It had no air conditioning, the nearest town was a half-hour drive away, and the only entertainment was watching the sheep graze and listening to Aunt Maribel's endless stories about her years as a teacher in the town. Additionally, the year before, during a brief weekend visit, Miguel had developed a terrible allergy to the pollen in the area. When I got home that night, I found Carlos sitting in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring cold coffee. He explained to me, without looking me in the eyes, that perhaps his mother was right, that the country house would be safer for the children. "Think about it," he said in that soft voice he used when trying to avoid conflict. "We wouldn't have to worry about children drowning in the sea, and the country air is healthier than the beach air." I saw in his eyes that gleam of submission that hurt me so much, that inability to set boundaries with his mother, even at the expense of his own family's wishes. It was the same look she had when Elena rearranged our wedding, when she insisted that we baptize the children in her parish instead of ours, when she suggested that Carlos turn down a better-paying job in Madrid because it was too far from home. The children were devastated. I found Lucia in her room, hugging the bodyboard we had given her for her birthday, sobbing silently. Miguel, for his part, had locked himself in the bathroom and refused to come out, shouting that he hated the countryside and that he didn't want to sneeze again for weeks like the last time. That night, as I watched my children cry over a cancelled vacation and my husband avoid conflict by locking himself in his study with the excuse of finishing some urgent reports, something broke inside me. I sat on the balcony of our apartment, looking at the city lights and listening to the nighttime bustle of the Rizafa neighborhood. The laughter coming from the corner bar, the clicking of heels of the last passers-by returning home, the occasional tram passing along the avenue, all these familiar sounds of my life in Valencia seemed to mock my helplessness. I remembered the conversation I had had the previous week with my friend Sofia in the cafeteria next to the Plaza del Ayuntamiento. "Auntie, it's not normal," he had told me while stirring his horchata. "Your mother-in-law is not being a grandmother, she is trying to be a second mother, and that cannot be." Sofia, who had known Elena since before my wedding to Carlos, had witnessed firsthand how the situation had deteriorated over the years. The problem wasn't just the cancelled vacation, it was the final straw for years of interference and manipulation. I thought about all the times Elena had undermined my authority as a mother, when she took the children to get haircuts without consulting me, when she enrolled Lucia in catechism classes even though we had decided to wait until she was older to make religious decisions, when she bought Miguel a PlayStation after we specifically told him we didn't want him to have video games yet. I remembered Elena's face when I told her I wanted to go back to work after my maternity leave. "Oh, daughter, but who is going to take care of the house? Carlos is used to having everything perfect, like I did for him." As if my degree in marketing and my years of experience were worth less than knowing how to fold the sheets the way she liked. And Carlos, instead of defending me, had limited himself to muttering something about finding a balance. The emotional manipulation was constant and subtle. Elena had perfected the art of making seemingly innocent comments that were laden with criticism and guilt. "Carlos is so thin, does he not like your food? The children are very tan, do you put enough sunscreen on them? Lucia has dark circles under her eyes, I'm sure it's because you let her stay up late watching television." Each comment was a small poison dart, designed to make me feel inadequate as a wife and mother. Upstairs, she could hear Carlos pacing back and forth in his study, probably torn between his loyalty to his mother and his duty as a husband and father. It was a family dance. Whenever a conflict arose with Elena, Carlos would withdraw, waiting for the storm to pass without having to take sides. But this time it was different. This time, the storm wasn't going to just pass. I pulled out my iPad and started doing what I did best, research and plan. I looked for articles on toxic relationships between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, on emotional dependence in mother-child relationships, on establishing healthy boundaries in family relationships. The stories I found resonated painfully with my situation: mothers who couldn't let go of their grip on their adult children, families destroyed by constant interference, couples on the verge of divorce due to in-laws meddling. At midnight, when the neighborhood had finally fallen silent, I made a decision. I realized that if I didn't do something drastic, this pattern would continue to affect not only my marriage, but also the emotional development of my children. She could already see how Miguel had begun to display the same evasive behavior as his father when conflicts arose, and how Lucia constantly sought her grandmother's approval before making even the smallest decisions. The problem went beyond a ruined vacation. It was about the future of my family, about the kind of adults my children would become, about the kind of marriage I wanted to have. Did he want Lucia to grow up thinking that it was normal for a woman to always give in to the desires of others? Did you want Miguel to learn that avoiding conflict was more important than standing up for what is right? While the rest of the house slept, I made a list of all the times Elena had crossed major boundaries in the past few years. It was a long and painful list, from decisions about the children's education to attempts to control our social life, from constant criticism of my way of running the house to interference in our intimacy as a couple. Each incident alone might seem minor, but together they formed a clear pattern of control and manipulation. I also thought about Carlos, about the child he must have been, always trying to please a mother who used love as a tool of control. I thought about how that boy had grown into a man who couldn't defend his own family for fear of disappointing his mother. My heart broke for him, but I also knew that his inability to set boundaries was hurting our family. At 3 in the morning, Carlos finally left his study and found me still on the balcony. She sat next to me silently, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like she really saw me, not as the daughter-in-law her mother constantly criticized, but as the woman she had chosen to share her life with. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and even though I knew he meant the vacation, I felt like he was apologizing for so much more. After that night on the balcony, I spent several days researching options. Between cups of coffee at Bar Cristal, near my office, I dedicated my breaks to searching the internet for professionals who could help us. I didn't want just any therapist. I needed someone who understood the complexity of Spanish family relationships, someone who could navigate the subtleties of a situation where respect for elders is often confused with absolute submission. It was Maria, my coworker, who told me about Dr. Ramirez. My cousin went through something similar with her mother-in-law, she told me as we shared an omelette on our lunch break. This doctor is a specialist in family relationships, especially in cases of mothers-in-law, let's say, too involved. The way Maria raised her eyebrows as she said that last made me smile for the first time in days. Dr. Ramirez had her office in a modernist building in Ensanche, with a waiting room that smelled of lavender and where classical music played softly. When I called her to make an appointment, her calm, professional voice gave me immediate confidence. I briefly explained our situation and scheduled an initial session, but with one special condition: the first session would be just for Carlos and me. I knew that if Elena found out that we were seeking professional help, she would try to manipulate the situation in her favor. During the week leading up to the appointment, I became a kind of private detective in my own home. I began to meticulously document Elena's every intervention in our family life. I installed an app on my phone to record conversations, something that made me feel guilty, but necessary. Elena's daily calls became evidence. "Son, why don't you come to eat today? I have prepared meatballs the way you like them," ignoring that Carlos had an important work lunch. "Do the children already have their clothes ready for Sunday? Because I have seen some beautiful outfits at El Corte Inglés, even though we had already bought them new clothes." I saved every WhatsApp message, every email. Elena had a habit of sending long voice messages, complaining about how alone she was, about how her friends saw more of their grandchildren than she did, although she spent more time with Lucia and Miguel than many parents with their own children. These messages, filled with guilt and emotional manipulation, became part of my archive. I also asked our closest friends to write down their observations about how this dynamic affected our family. Paco and Carmen, our neighbors in 4A, with whom we used to have dinners on Saturdays until Elena started casually showing up every time we invited them, wrote a letter detailing how they had seen our family dynamic change over the years. "Before you were a happy couple," Carmen wrote. "Now it seems like you're always on your cell phone, waiting for Elena's next call." My sister Raquel, who lived in Barcelona but visited us frequently, sent a long email describing how she had noticed that the children behaved differently when Elena was present, more tense, less spontaneous. "The other day," he wrote, "I saw Lucia throw away a drawing she had made because her grandmother commented that trees are not drawn purple. It broke my heart. I needed all this evidence not only for the therapist, but also for Carlos. My husband had a tendency to minimize his mother's behavior, seeing it as normal or well-intentioned. I needed him to see the whole pattern, not just the isolated incidents that he could easily justify. I also began to set up small barriers, subtle but firm. The first step was to change the lock on the back door that Elena used to use to enter without warning. When he asked me about it, I told him matter-of-factly that the old lock had been damaged. "It's just that these modern locks aren't like the old ones," I commented, using the kind of phrase she used to say. I saw a flash of suspicion in his eyes, but he couldn't complain without admitting that I was trying to sneak in. I began to forget to inform him about the children's daily activities. When I asked why I hadn't told him that Lucia had a dance festival at school, he responded with a simple, I thought I had already told you about it," or, "I've just been very busy with work these days." Small omissions that were building a wall of privacy around our family. At work, I asked to change my schedule so I could pick up the kids from school myself. Elena used to use that time to create dependency, staying at home, helping with homework until Carlos got home from work. Now, even though it meant juggling my schedules and meetings, I could be present for those important moments. Every small action was a step towards recovering our family autonomy. Like drops of water that little by little erode a rock, each small change created space between Elena and our daily lives. It wasn't easy. Every no to his suggestions, every time he forgot to invite her to an activity, every boundary he set generated drama and complaints. "You just don't love me anymore," he said with a trembling voice when I explained that no, he couldn't come with us to the movies because it was a family outing. "The children miss me," he insisted when I told him that there was no need for him to come pick them up from school. "Carlos has always needed my help with important papers," I argued when I asked him not to reorganize my husband's office. One afternoon, while I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, I heard Elena on the phone with one of her friends. He had left the speakerphone activated, probably without realizing it, and his voice echoed from the living room, "My daughter-in-law has been very strange lately, Concha. I think she's trying to keep me away from my grandchildren. Can you believe that the other day he told me that I didn't need to buy them clothes? As if a grandmother couldn't give gifts to her grandchildren. That conversation confirmed to me that I was on the right path. Elena was realizing that her control was diminishing, and that was causing her to react exactly as she expected, with more attempts at emotional manipulation. But this time I was prepared. I also began to work on strengthening my relationship with Carlos outside of his mother's influence. I started planning surprise dates, taking him to places we liked when we were dating. One Friday I surprised him with tickets to a concert at the Palau de la Música. Another day I took him to dinner at that small restaurant next to the market where we had our first date. Little reminders of who we were as a couple before Elena's shadow became so overwhelming. Preparation for our first therapy session was meticulous. I organized all my documents, evidence, and notes in a folder. I included photos of family moments where Elena's interference could be clearly seen, birthdays where she monopolized all the attention, vacations where she appeared uninvited, important moments for the children where she had anticipated our decisions as parents. The night before our first session, while the kids were sleeping, I sat in the kitchen going over all the material one last time. Carlos found me there, surrounded by papers and with my third cup of lime blossom of the night. He sat across from me and, for the first time in a long time, actually asked me how I was feeling. Not the usual, "Are you okay?" automatic, but a sincere question, with his eyes fixed on mine. I explained to him that this wasn't just about his mother, but about us as a family. About the type of parents we wanted to be, about the environment in which we wanted our children to grow up. I told him about my fears, fear that our marriage would deteriorate under his mother's constant pressure, fear that our children would grow up thinking that toxic family relationships were normal, fear of losing our identity as a couple and as a family. Carlos listened in silence, and for the first time, he did not try to defend his mother or minimize the situation. When I finished speaking, he took my hand on the table and squeezed it gently. "Tomorrow we will go to therapy together," he said simply. In those 5 words I heard more support than he had shown me in years. The morning of our first therapy session dawned with that humid heat typical of Valencia that makes even breathing difficult. We dropped the kids off at school like any other day, trying to maintain a semblance of normality even though inside I felt a knot in my stomach. We had told Elena that we had a meeting at the bank to prevent her from offering to pick up the children, a little lie that had become necessary. Dr. Ramirez's office was in an old but well-preserved building in the Gran Via neighborhood. The elevator, one of those old ones with wrought iron doors, took us to the 4th floor. In the waiting room, Carlos kept moving his leg, a nervous gesture he had inherited from his father. I took her hand and squeezed it gently, grateful that she had come despite her reservations. Dr. Ramirez was not what I had imagined. I was hoping to find someone older, with that authoritarian air that some therapists have. Instead, we were greeted by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. His office was a cozy space, with plants in the windows and paintings of Valencian landscapes on the walls. The sound of a small water fountain in the corner created a serene atmosphere. "Tell me what brings you here," he said after initial introductions. His voice had that soft accent of someone who has lived in various parts of Spain. I pulled out the folder with all the documentation I had collected, but she gently told me to set it aside for the moment. "First, I want to hear your story, in your own words." And so began the most intense and revealing session of our lives. I explained our situation in detail, trying to be as objective as possible. I talked about how Elena's control had been gradually increasing, like a frog in water that is slowly heated to a boil. I described the small incidents that had built up to create a mountain of tension and resentment. Carlos remained silent, looking at their clasped hands. Dr. Ramirez gently asked him what he thought of all this. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. "It's just, she's my mother," he said, as if those 3 words explained everything. And in a way, they did. The doctor created a safe space where I could finally express my feelings without fear of being judged. I told her about the sleepless nights worrying about the impact this situation was having on our children. About how he had seen Lucia's happy personality change, becoming more insecure and in need of constant approval. about how Miguel had started showing signs of anxiety, especially before his grandmother's visits. Tears flowed as I described a recent incident. Lucia had won a drawing contest at school, but instead of being excited, her first reaction was to ask if Grandma would like her drawing. "I don't want my children to grow up thinking that their worth depends on the approval of others," I said between sobs. Dr. Ramirez offered me a box of tissues with a sympathetic look. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Ramirez began working with Carlos. Through carefully worded questions, she helped my husband see the pattern of emotional manipulation his mother had established since his childhood. The doctor asked him to remember specific moments from his childhood, decisions he had made or failed to make to please his mother. "Do you remember a time when you wanted to do something different than what your mother had planned for you?" the doctor asked. Carlos was silent for a moment, and then began to talk about how he had wanted to study architecture, his true passion, but had ended up studying business because his mother insisted that it was more sensible and what his father would have wanted. Through specific exercises, Carlos began to recognize how his mother used guilt and emotional blackmail to maintain control over him. Dr. Ramirez showed her how seemingly innocent phrases like, "After everything I've sacrificed for you," or "I only want the best for my son," were actually tools of manipulation. "Your mother," the doctor explained, "probably developed this controlling behavior in response to her own fears and traumas. Your father's early death likely intensified her need for control. But understanding her motives doesn't mean you should allow this pattern to continue affecting your own family." As the session progressed, Carlos began to open up more. She talked about the constant weight of her mother's expectations, about how every decision in her adult life was colored by the implicit question of, "What will Mom think?" He described the anxiety he felt every time he had to choose between his mother's wishes and those of his own family. Dr. Ramirez guided us through a role-playing exercise, where Carlos had to practice saying no to his mother's excessive demands. At first, it was almost physically painful to say that simple word. "It's like I feel like I'm betraying her," he admitted. The doctor helped her understand that establishing healthy boundaries is not a betrayal, but rather an act of self-love and protection toward her nuclear family. As I watched Carlos work with the therapist, I felt a mix of pain and hope. Pain at seeing how deeply ingrained these behavior patterns were, and hope at seeing that we were finally confronting the problem constructively. Dr. Ramirez also made us see how this pattern of behavior was affecting our children. "Children learn more from what they see than from what we tell them," he explained. "What message are they getting when they see their father unable to set boundaries with their grandmother? What are they learning about family relationships and respect?" At the end of the session, Carlos cried like a child. They weren't silent tears of frustration like I'd seen him shed before, but deep sobs that seemed to come from a very old place inside him. He admitted that he had always known something was wrong, but that the fear of disappointing his mother had paralyzed him. "She's always been alone," he said through tears. "Ever since Dad died, I've been his only family." Dr. Ramirez helped her see that, although her mother's pain was real, it was not her responsibility to sacrifice her own family's emotional health to compensate for her own shortcomings. "Your mother needs to develop her own life, her own interests and relationships," he explained. "Your role is not to be your only source of emotional satisfaction." It was a painful but necessary moment of vulnerability and honesty. Seeing Carlos finally facing these difficult truths made me realize how much I had been loading too. It was not just me who suffered under the control of Elena. Carlos had been caught in this dynamic his whole life. The doctor assigned us tasks for the next session. Carlos had to begin to say no to his mother in small things, gradually building his trust. I had to continue documenting the interactions, but now with an approach on how we responded to Elena's manipulation, not only in its actions. He also gave us exercises to do together as a couple. We had to spend time talk about our feelings without mentioning Elena, reconnecting as a couple beyond problems with her mother. He suggested establishing a daily, family time, where mobile phones were off and care was completely focused on us and children. When we left the consultation, the afternoon sun bathed the streets of Valencia with a golden light. We walked silently to the car, each processing what had happened in the session. Before starting, Carlos took my hand. "Sorry," he said simply. Throughout. In his eyes I saw something that I had not seen in a long time: determination. The days following our first therapy session were like walking on fine ice. Carlos and I, armed with the tools provided by Dr. Ramirez, began to implement small changes in our daily routine. Every morning, before the children woke up, we sat in the kitchen to have coffee together and plan how we would handle Elena's inevitable interventions that day. The first real test came when we decided to write an email to Elena, clearly establishing the new limits of your participation in our family life. We sat in the small study we shared, in front of the computer, while the children saw drawings in the room. Carlos wrote and erased phrases, looking for the balance between firmness and respect. I was surprised to see how much hands were trembling on the keyboard. "Dear Mom," the mail began, "after much reflection, we felt that it is important, Dr. Ramirez." We explained that, although we loved it and valued their role as a grandmother, we needed space to grow as a nuclear family. We established clear rules: visits should be scheduled in advance, no more tickets without warning our house. The decisions about children, from their education to their extracurricular activities, would be taken exclusively by us as parents. Large gifts or decisions that will affect family routine should be consulted with us first. Elena's initial reaction was exactly like Dr. Ramirez had predicted, an explosion of drama that began with a crying call at 3 in the morning. "You don't love me in your life anymore?" I sobbed on the phone. "After everything I have done for you, do you pay me?" Carlos kept calm, repeating the phrases we had practiced in therapy: "Mom, we love you and want you to remain part of our lives, but we need to establish some healthy limits." The threats of moving away forever soon arriving. Elena began a call campaign to all relatives, presenting himself as the victim of ungrateful children. Carlos's aunts began to call, some to mediate, others to scold us for making a poor widow suffer. We even received a surprise visit from the parish priest of the church where Elena was voluntary, who came to talk about the importance of the family. Emotional manipulation attempts were especially directed to Carlos. Elena began to complain about mysterious pain, hinting that the stress of our rejection was affecting his health. I sent old photos of Carlos as a child with messages like, "When my son still loved me." He called the children directly to their mobile phones, which we decided to confiscate, to tell them how much I missed them and how sad it was because Mom and Dad did not let her see them. However, this time it was different. Carlos remained firm, supported by our therapy sessions and my constant support. When Elena appeared without notifying us Sunday morning, supposedly because he passed here, Carlos reminded him kindly but firmly our agreement on scheduled visits. It was painful to see the wounded expression on his mother's face, but it was necessary. We implement significant changes in our daily routine. The first and most important was to change the house locks. Elena would no longer have a key to our home, a change that she took as a personal affront. "What happens if there is an emergency?" he protested. "For emergencies are emergency services, Mom," Carlos replied with a calm that filled me with pride. Visits now had to be scheduled in advance, and we established clear limits on their duration. No more those endless visits that extended from breakfast to dinner. Elena could come to lunch on Sundays, or spend an afternoon during the week with the children, but always with established and respected schedules. Excessive and unra. Requested gifts also stopped. When Elena appeared with a new bicycle for Miguel, although she already had a perfectly functional, Carlos returned it, explaining that large gifts needed to be consulted first. "But it's my money, I can spend it as I want," she protested. "Yes, but they are our children and we decided what is appropriate for them," he replied. Decisions about our children would be taken exclusively by us as parents. When Elena tried to register Lucia in piano classes without consulting us, we cancelled registration and explained that such decisions were out of their limits as a grandmother. It was especially difficult because Lucia, influenced by her grandmother's enthusiasm, was initially disappointed. We had to explain it with patience why it was important that these decisions were made as their parents. Each little victory in establishing these limits strengthened our relationship and our trust as a couple. Carlos began showing more initiative in family decision-making, no longer constantly looking for his mother's approval. He began planning activities for weekends without consulting with Elena, something that would have been unthinkable before. Children, although initially confused by changes, began to show positive signs. Lucia began to make more independent decisions about her clothes and activities, without constantly asking, "What would the grandmother say?" Miguel stopped hiding in his room when the bell sounded, no longer fearing that every visit was a surprise invasion of his grandmother. We implement a new family routine on Sundays. Instead of the mandatory meals at Elena's house, we begin to explore different places in the Valencian community. We visited Zataiva Castle, we walked through the medieval streets of Morella, we discovered small coastal villages that we had never visited. These trips helped us to reconnect as a family and create new traditions. Telephone calls were also regulated. No more calls at any time of day or night. We established specific schedules for Elena to talk to the children, and maintained these conversations in the speaker to monitor any attempt at emotional manipulation. When she tried to make guilty comments, the call ended kindly but firmly. Dr. Ramirez helped us handle the difficult moments. He reminded us that the establishment of healthy limits often feels uncomfortable at the beginning, especially for those who have lived without them for so long. He taught us to recognize and manage the fault that arose every time we had to say, "No, Elena." It also helped us understand that change would not be immediate or perfect. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, days when guilt and family pressure would make us question our decisions. But he gave us tools to handle these moments: breathing exercises for Carlos when anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, assertive communication techniques for me when frustration made me want to scream. Family therapy became a regular part of our routine. Once a week, while the children were in their extracurricular activities, Carlos and I sat in the cozy office of Dr. Ramirez to process the events of the week and plan our following actions. These sessions became an anchor, a safe space where we could be completely honest about our fears and frustrations. Changes in our family dynamics began to be noticed in unexpected aspects. The dinners became more relaxed, with real conversations instead of tense silences. The children began to share their thoughts and feelings more openly, no longer fearful that anything they said would reach their grandmother's ears and were used as manipulation material. Carlos rediscovered old passions that he had abandoned to please his mother. He began taking drawing classes on Saturday mornings, something that Elena considered a waste of time for a businessman. Seeing him return home with his sketches, with a genuine smile on his face, reminded me of the man who had fallen in love with. 6 months after our initial confrontation, our family life had become in ways that would never have imagined possible. The most notable change was seen in children. Lucia had recovered her spontaneous laugh, the one that had missed so much. He no longer constantly asked if he was doing things good according to his grandmother's standards. Six resumed his passion for football, and now he shone in the women's team, without worrying about whether or not it was an activity appropriate for a lady. Miguel also flourished in this new, more relaxed atmosphere. His anxiety episodes had decreased considerably, and no longer hid in his room every time the bell sounded. One day, while we prepared cookies together in the kitchen, an activity that would have previously caused the immediate appearance of Elena to supervise, I realized that I was not seeing my nail bite, a habit that I had developed during the years of greater control of his grandmother. Carlos had discovered a new confidence in his role as a husband and father. He no longer consulted his phone compulsively to see if he had messages or lost calls from his mother. I made decisions without the constant need for maternal approval, from small things such as choosing children's clothes for school to more important decisions such as planning family vacations. The afternoons after school had become our special moment. Without Elena's constant presence, we could create our own routines. Sometimes we did the homework in the park near home, other times the children invited their friends to play. The house was filled with laughter and the normal chaos of a family with children, without the tension that previously accompanied every moment. An afternoon, while helping Lucia with her science project in the dining room, I was surprised to hear her hum that. It was such a simple but significant image, my daughter, relaxed and happy in her own home, without worrying about whether someone would suddenly appear to criticize their way of doing things. On weekends they had become true family adventures. We were no longer tied to the mandatory visits to Elena's house. Instead, we explored new places together. On a Saturday we could be walking through the cobbled streets of Peníscola, and the next, discovering small restaurants in the Barrio del Carmen. Carlos had developed an interest in photography, and now our exits always included stops to capture special moments. Surprisingly, Elena also began to show signs of change. After several months of resistance, and probably seeing that his son was happier and safest, he began to respect our limits. At first, the change was more out of necessity than by conviction. He realized that if he wanted to remain part of our lives, he would have to adapt to the new rules. Visits, although less frequent, became more significant and pleasant. Elena began arriving at the agreed time. She no longer appeared, coincidentally, at any time of the day. He learned to call before coming, and respected when we told him it wasn't a good time. The constant tension that used to permeate our interactions was replaced by a cautious but growing mutual respect. An especially memorable Sunday, Elena surprised us all. He had come to lunch, as was our new custom, and brought an old photo album that none of us had seen before. While we had coffee on the terrace, he began to share stories of his own childhood, how his mother had also been a controlling woman, how he had sworn to be different but without realizing he had repeated the same patterns. I didn't realize how much damage I was doing, he admitted as he passed the album pages. When your father died, he told Carlos, I was so afraid of losing you too that I acceded. It was the first time that we heard her recognize, even if it was indirectly, that her behavior had been problematic. Children also developed a healthier relationship with their grandmother. They no longer saw her as an authority figure that competed with her parents, but as a grandmother who could be fun and affectionate without being invasive. Elena learned to enjoy her grandmother's role without trying to usurp the role of mother. One day, while Elena played cards with the children in the living room, a scheduled activity and with clear time limits, I realized that I no longer felt that tension in the stomach that used to accompany their visits. The children laughed genuinely with their stories, and she seemed more relaxed as well, as if the weight of having to control everything had finally risen from their shoulders. Dr. Ramirez had helped us understand that real change required time and patience. He explained that we were breaking behavior patterns that had been established for decades, and that it was normal to find resistance and occasional setbacks. In our monitoring sessions, we work on strategies to maintain these positive changes. We learned to recognize the early signals of when the old patterns threatened to resurface, and we developed action plans to address them before they became major problems. Carlos and I also rediscovered our relationship as a couple. Without Elena's constant shadow on our decisions, we could concentrate on strengthening our link. We resumed old customs like our events on Friday night, something we had abandoned because Elena always found a reason to need Carlos just those days. One night, while we had dinner at our favorite restaurant in the port, Carlos confessed something that moved me deeply. Do you know? For the first time in my adult life, I feel that I am really living my own life, not the one that my mother planned for me. I saw in his eyes a peace that had not been there before, a security in itself that had been buried under years of emotional manipulation. Our house was also physically transformed. We no longer had to keep things like Elena liked. We paint the walls of different colors, reorganize the furniture according to our tastes, and allow children to decorate their rooms as they would like. Lucia chose a mural of stars for her roof, something that would have caused a long speech of Elena on how that was not appropriate. Birthdays and family celebrations also changed. They were no longer tense events where every detail had to be approved by Elena. Now we could celebrate our way, with the music we liked, the food we wanted, and the guests we chose. Elena learned to be one more guest, not the main organizer of each event. The holidays became true moments of rest and family fun. The summer following our confrontation, we finally made that trip to Benidorm that Elena had cancelled. Seeing the children running along the beach, Carlos relaxed under the sun, and yes, even Elena, who had been invited to come a couple of days under our conditions, enjoying without trying to control every moment, was a confirmation that we had made the right decision. The relationship with the rest of the family also gradually improved. The aunts of Carlos, who at first had criticized us for making Elena suffer, began to see the positive changes in our family dynamics. Some even admitted privately that they had always thought that Elena was too controlling, but they had never dared to say it. The neighbors of the neighborhood, who had been silent witnesses of years of family drama, noticed the change. Mrs. Amparo, who had comforted me so much in the difficult times, told me one day while tending her clothes, "Daughter, you look happier to everyone. Even Elena seems quieter now that she doesn't have to be aware of everything." At school, teachers commented on the change in children. Lucia's tutor told us at the last meeting that the girl participated more in class and was safer of herself. Miguel had improved his notes and made new friends, was no longer as retracted as before.